All right, let's talk about the Atlanta housing market because honestly, it's a bit of a head scratcher. You hear one thing, but then the data says something totally different. Is it a hot market? Is it cooling off? Let's dig in and figure out what's really going on.
Okay, so the first thing that probably jumps out at you when you look at Atlanta real estate is this big number right here, $430,000. That's the median list price. And yeah, that's a little higher than the national average. It's the kind of number that makes you immediately think, wow, okay, this has got to be a crazy seller's market, right?
And that's really the big question we're tackling today. I mean, with a price tag that high, it just has to be a seller's market, doesn't it? You'd think sellers hold all the cards, but what if I told you that's not the whole story? That's the perception we're about to test.
Yeah, because as soon as you look past that flashy price tag, things get, well, a lot more complicated. And honestly, way more interesting. The data starts to show some pretty big cracks in that whole seller's market story. So, okay, let's dive into this.
All right, first piece of the puzzle, supply. It's simple, right? How many homes are actually out there for sale? This is usually the first big clue that tells us which way the wind is blowing in a market.
And to measure this, we use something called months of supply. It's a really key metric. Basically, just imagine if nobody listed a new house starting today. This number tells you how many months it would take to sell every single home that's currently on the market. Super simple. A bigger number means more houses, more choices for buyers.
Okay, and this is where it starts to get really interesting. See, the US average for supply is pretty tight. We're talking just 2.8 months. But then you look at Atlanta, and it's at 3.4 months. That might not sound like a huge jump, but in real estate terms, it's a pretty big deal. This is our first major clue that something different is happening in Atlanta.
So what does that actually mean for you? The takeaway is pretty simple. Right off the bat, we can see that buyers in Atlanta actually have more options and are facing less crazy competition than the average home buyer in the US. More supply? Well, that always starts to shift the power.
Okay, so let's build on that. If supply is up, what's the next logical step? Well, it means sellers have to start competing with each other a little more. And what happens when sellers compete? They negotiate. And the easiest way to see that happening is by looking at price cuts.
And whoa, the number here is pretty wild. Nearly 40%. Think about that. Almost 4 out of every 10 homes for sale in Atlanta have had their price dropped. That's a ton of sellers realizing they have to come down to get a deal done.
Now, to put that number in perspective, in what you'd call a normal or typical market, you might see about 30, maybe 35% of homes with price cuts. Atlanta, at nearly 40%, is way above that. It's a flashing red light that buyer demand just isn't what it used to be.
And it doesn't stop there. Here's another piece of evidence that points in the same direction. Over 20%, 1 in 5 of the homes for sale in Atlanta are actually relisted. So what does that mean? It means they tried to sell once, couldn't find a buyer, took the house off the market, and are now trying again. You know, market analysts start to raise an eyebrow when this relisting number gets to around 10%. Atlanta is sitting at over 20%. That's more than double the warning level. It's just a crystal clear sign that sellers are swinging for the fences with their initial price and they're striking out.
So you put all this together, more supply, more price cuts, more relistings, and what do you get? Well, you get houses that just sit on the market longer. It's simple. Nationally, the median time is about 77 days. But in Atlanta, it's 84 days, a whole extra week. Sellers are definitely having to be more patient.
Okay, so let's recap. We've got more supply, and we've got sellers who are clearly having to negotiate more. But what about that huge price tag we saw at the very beginning, that $430,000 number? Let's go back to that because this is where the story really takes a surprising twist.
All right, let's look at that number again, the one that started this whole conversation. And yes, this chart confirms it. Atlanta's median list price, $430,000, is a little bit higher than the national median. So on the surface, you just say, yep, Atlanta's more expensive, end of story. But is it really? Is it actually more expensive? Not so fast, because that list price, it only tells you half the story. It tells you what you pay, but it doesn't tell you what you get for that money.
And here it is. This is the big reveal. The moment you stop looking at the total price and start looking at the price per square foot, the whole narrative flips on its head. The US average is almost $210 a square foot, but in Atlanta, it's down at $188. That is a huge difference in value.
So what does this mean? I love how the source data puts it just plain and simple.
Atlanta buyers receive more space per dollar spent. And that's really the bottom line, isn't it? At the end of the day, your dollar just goes further in Atlanta. It buys you more actual space. Okay, let's put this all together now. We've looked at the supply, we've looked at how sellers are behaving, and we've uncovered the real story behind that big price tag. So, what's the final verdict here? What's really happening in the Atlanta housing market?
Well, the evidence seems pretty clear when you lay it all out. You've got higher than average inventory, you've got way more sellers cutting their prices, you've got homes sitting on the market longer, and maybe most importantly, you're getting way more bang for your buck on a square foot basis.
So here's the bottom line. That high sticker price, it's kind of an illusion. It makes Atlanta look like a brutal market for buyers, but the reality on the ground is completely different. When you look under the hood, all the data shows that the negotiating power, it's really shifting over to the buyer's side of the table.
The data is definitely showing a shift, and that could mean there's a real window of opportunity here for buyers. See, the story of Atlanta's market isn't about being impossible. It's about being in the middle of a big change. So for anyone out there looking to buy in Atlanta, the real question you have to ask yourself is, how long is this window going to stay open?